Well, by now, I think you're probably pretty well convinced that cells can do some very amazing things. In addition to taking things in, metabolizing them, eliminating waste products, some cells can move, some cells store things, some cells digest things, some cells can transmit action potentials. Cells can do a lot of very cool things. Well, in this particular case, we're talking about cells communicating with each other. Well, we have already talked about neurotransmitters, how a nerve cell will release a chemical that will stimulate or inhibit the next neuron or the target tissue. So neurotransmitters are a mechanism by which cells can communicate with each other. But cells also release chemicals which will influence their own physiology. If the cell releases a chemical and that chemical actually influences the cell that made the chemical, it is called an intracrine secretion. Now, cells are together in tissues, so there are cells right next to each other or in the same neighborhood. So when a cell releases a chemical and that chemical influences or controls, stimulates or inhibits other cells in the neighborhood, that is called a paracrine secretion. When cells release chemicals into the blood, and the blood transports them through the body where they find receptor sites on other cells. And those chemicals bind at those receptor sites elsewhere in the body and communicate with or otherwise influence or control the activities of the target cell. Those are called endocrine secretions. Endocrine is translated, it secretes within. Well, what that means is that the secretion goes into the blood. So it is an endocrine secretion if it goes from the cell that made it into the blood and travels by way of the blood to distant cells that have receptor sites for it. So that's what the endocrine system is, and we call those secretions of those cells hormones. So that's what chapter 17 is all about, the endocrine system, the many glands and tissues that make endocrine secretions, their receptors, and the influence that the chemical or the hormone has on the target tissue. So this all begins with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is nervous tissue. It is part of the brain, but some nerve cells secrete hormones. They're called neuroendocrine cells. So we begin our study of endocrinology with the hypothalamus because it releases the hormones that influence other glands. So we can say with some accuracy that the hypothalamus is the master of the endocrine system as well as being the manager of the autonomic nervous system and the headquarters for all homeostasis. Remember that the hypothalamus is a 24/7 blood chemistry monitor. So it will monitor the temperature of the blood, it will monitor the water content of the blood, it will monitor the nutrient content of the blood, and if anything is off, the hypothalamus will take action to correct it. Some of those actions involve the secretion of hormones. So the hypothalamus is our homeostasis headquarters, and this is one of the activities, one of the many activities of the hypothalamus is releasing hormones that will ultimately change the physiology of other cells. So let's have a look at slide 2, just so you can remember where this hypothalamus actually is. In Structure and Function 1, we covered the anatomy of the human brain in pretty good detail. So this should look very familiar to all of you. This obviously is a mid-sagittal section of the human brain. So you should be able to point to and identify the cingulate gyrus, that's the noodle that runs directly over the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is shown in purple. The space below the corpus callosum is the lateral ventricle. The floor of the lateral ventricle is the fornix. There is a very thin space between the fornix and the thalamus, that is the third ventricle. And of course, that egg-shaped, golden colored area right in the middle, that is the thalamus. The word thalamus is translated the inner room. Well, that's okay. The hypothalamus then would be the area below the inner room. So the hypothalamus is actually a very small area of the brain, but it's about the busiest beehive you would ever want to encounter. Notice also going or coming from the anterior side, they're coming from the area of the eyes, that little blonde strand, that would be the olfactory tract. Notice how it runs directly at the hypothalamus. Well, we made a connection between the sense of smell and limbic system structures, such as the hypothalamus. We have a very strong memory of smells, and smells elicit very strong emotional responses. So, what you're looking at here in color are some of the limbic system structures, but this is a good illustration to show you where the hypothalamus is actually located. Now, the hypothalamus does extend down toward the roof of the mouth by a stalk that's called the infundibulum. At the tip end of the infundibulum is part gland and part nervous tissue. We call that the hypophysis or the pituitary gland. So we are situated then directly over the roof of the mouth. Turns out that's where the smart guys got the name pituitary. They thought the thing made spit, and so they called it pituitary. And I didn't make that up, that is a true story. So you can see where we are there. Basically, behind the eyes, the optic chiasm will cross right in front of the pituitary gland. So the other limbic system structures that are shown there, the amygdala, remember the amygdala is particularly associated with the emotion of fear. The way that we know that is if a person has a damaged or diseased amygdala, they lose their sense of fear. Also shown there, the hippocampus. Remember that the hippocampus is the area of the brain where we process memories and make determinations as to what should be stored as long-term memory, what should be kept transiently as short-term memory, or what should be just simply discarded after a few seconds. Anyway, this mid-sagittal will show you where we are when we're talking about structures that we're going to detail, the hypothalamus and the hypophysis, which is the UCA word for pituitary gland. Also, let me say this for the 99th time. It is essential for students who are trying to learn anatomy and physiology that you take notes. Write down what you're hearing. Don't just listen to it. You write it down. You should have a notebook, you should have a pen, and you should be writing down what I'm saying. These images that you're looking at, don't just look at them. Draw them, label them. This is how you learn this stuff. The words that we come across here, Speak them out loud. Spell them correctly. Tell little sister about them. These are the essentials for learning this science. And I would that you be expert in these things because many of you will be going into professions where you will have to use that knowledge for the benefit of other people. Also, when other people hear you speaking of these things with some degree of expertise, they will know that you must have gone to UCA. Next slide, please. A little more close-up illustration of the hypothalamus here. To help you get oriented, the person's eyes and face would be to the left. The back of the head would be to the right. In the central nervous system, there are congregations of nerve cell bodies. Those are called nuclei in the central nervous system. If we were talking about the peripheral nervous system, congregations of nerve cell bodies there are called ganglia. You can see in this illustration that the hypothalamus is chock full of these nuclei. Many of them are directly involved in endocrine functions. For instance, starting there on the left, the preoptic nucleus. This is the nucleus that secretes gonadotropin releasing hormone, which controls all of the reproductive functions in people. We will talk about gonadotropin releasing hormone and what happens in response to it later. Right now, just associate that with the preoptic nucleus. Not shown here for reasons I don't know, but in the same neighborhood as the preoptic nucleus, we would have the anterior nucleus. The anterior nucleus is primarily concerned with thirst. Remember, the hypothalamus monitors the water content of the blood. If the water content is low, then it stimulates the sensation of thirst. I am thirsty. Also associated with the anterior nucleus is our homeostatic control of our temperature. So we would call that thermoregulation. So I'm not sure why the anterior nucleus is not shown here, but it isn't. So anyway, associate those two functions, thirst and thermoregulation, with the anterior nucleus. The next one going down there is the dorsomedial nucleus of the hypothalamus. That is part of the limbic system, and its principal function, insofar as it is understood, is when it is stimulated, the person will demonstrate the emotion of rage or extreme anger. The paraventricular nucleus pointed to there and colored green. Paraventricular means alongside the ventricles. Well, we're talking about the third ventricle here. So the paraventricular nucleus is the primary secretor of the hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin, when released into the blood, will stimulate the uterus to contract at the time of labor. It also will stimulate the mammary glands to contract and therefore eject milk when the time for breastfeeding comes. The paraventricular nucleus also secretes some antidiuretic hormone. Principally, we associate paraventricular nucleus with oxytocin, but it does secrete some antidiuretic hormone. Which brings us to the next nucleus there, the supraoptic nucleus. That is the principal nucleus for the secretion of antidiuretic hormone, which is abbreviated ADH, which is translated no-no-PP hormone. So what we're talking about here is water conservation. So the receptor sites for that hormone would be the kidneys, and the instructions are stop eliminating my water. I need water in the blood. So it is no-no-PP hormone, antidiuretic hormone, ADH. Just south of there, we have the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That simply means over the optic chiasm. Remember, the optic chiasm is right there in front of and slightly above the pituitary gland. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus has receptor sites for a hormone produced by the pineal gland. The hormone produced by the pineal gland is melatonin. So when melatonin binds to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, then we become sleepy. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus is involved in the sleep-wake cycle, but it also controls all of the other physiologic cycles of the body in addition to just sleeping and waking. The body does have a circadian rhythm, a cycle which is repeated not exactly every 24 hours, closer to 25 hours, the release of various hormones and certain chemical changes, digestion, production of urine, various things like that. They operate on a cycle, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus is the manager of that cycle. Going down just from there, that is the stalk of the pituitary gland, which is called the infundibulum. Half of that stalk is nervous tissue, half of it is glandular tissue. So the pituitary gland itself is a combination of two different tissues. We have an anterior lobe, which is called the adenohypophysis. That is glandular epithelium. We have a posterior lobe, which is called the neurohypophysis. That is nervous tissue. It is actually simply a downgrowth of the hypothalamus itself. So the infundibulum is the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The next nucleus shown there is the arcuate nucleus. The arcuate nucleus is best known for being the secretor of a hormone called neuropeptide Y. Neuropeptide Y is released by the arcuate nucleus when it is stimulated by ghrelin. Ghrelin is a hormone released by the empty stomach. If the stomach is empty, it releases ghrelin. Ghrelin binds at the arcuate nucleus, which then releases neuropeptide Y, and the brain, the conscious aspect of the brain where the lights are on, gets the message, get something to eat. Remember, the hypothalamus is monitoring the blood chemistry, and if we're low in any of the nutrients, then the arcuate nucleus will stimulate or will release the neuropeptide Y, and we have what we call an appetite for a certain type of food. There are several hormones that inhibit the release of neuropeptide Y. Insulin is one of those. Leptin is one of those. Cholecystokinin. All three of those inhibit the release of neuropeptide Y from the arcuate nucleus, which signals you've had enough to eat. So they are satiety hormones in that respect. The next nucleus shown there is the mammillary body. The mammillary bodies also are part of the limbic system, principally involved in long-term memories. So the way that we know that is if the mammillary bodies are destroyed, the person loses the ability to form long-term memories. The next one shown there is the ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus. This is primarily our satiety center to tell us that you have had enough to eat and you need to stop eating now. The posterior hypothalamic nucleus, which is shown there, functions in cardiovascular control and also pain control. Okay, the only other thing shown there is the fornix. So if you follow the fornix from the floor of the lateral ventricles, it circles right around and all the way down to the hypothalamus. So the fornix also is part of the limbic system. So that's a pretty good introduction to the hypothalamic nuclei. So let's move on from there. All said and done, the hypothalamus releases 9 different hormones. 2 of those we have already mentioned, the oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, made by the paraventricular nucleus and supraoptic nucleus. Those hormones travel down the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract and are simply stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. The posterior lobe is nervous tissue. It is simply an extension of the hypothalamus. Embryologically, the little outgrowth of the hypothalamus that becomes the posterior pituitary is called the neurohypophyseal bud. Later, we simply call it the neurohypophysis. So 2 of the hypothalamic hormones are stored in the neurohypophysis, and from there they enter into the blood, and they will have their receptor sites in the case of the paraventricular nucleus or the oxytocin, the receptor sites there being the uterus, also the mammary glands, and also some other structures of the body that you can look up yourself. The ADH will have its receptor sites at the kidney tubules and is, as I mentioned earlier, involved in water conservation. The other part of the pituitary gland is glandular epithelium. It arises from the area of the throat in the embryo, and it is called the adenohypophyseal pouch. The adenohypophyseal pouch will become the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, which is called the adenohypophysis. So this illustration shows the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, particularly the 2 hormones that are stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. We will talk about the other 7 hormones on another slide, so let's move along to that. On the right side of the illustration, you can see the nuclei that make oxytocin and ADH. Those hormones travel by way of the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract down to the neurohypophysis, where there is the capillary bed formed by the inferior hypophyseal artery. So those 2 hormones are stored in the posterior pituitary and enter into the blood there and then travel by way of the blood to their target tissues. So we have already talked about those. On the left side of the illustration, we have a different design. Remember that the anterior pituitary gland is of a different embryologic origin than the posterior. So what we have here is called a portal system. A portal system is when you have a capillary bed that comes together to form a single vessel, which then breaks up into a second capillary bed. So you can see that we have a capillary bed in the hypothalamus. It comes together to form the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system or portal vein, which breaks up into a capillary bed in the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So the 7 hormones that are made by the hypothalamus to stimulate cells in the anterior pituitary gland travel by way of this portal system to the adenohypophysis. Hormone number 1, made by the hypothalamus, traveling by way of the portal system to the adenohypophysis, growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH, made by the hypothalamus, traveling to the anterior pituitary by way of the portal system, binding upon cells in the anterior pituitary that are called somatotropes. When the somatotropes bind GHRH, they release into the blood their hormone, which is simply called growth hormone. Growth hormone travels by way of the blood throughout the body and has receptor sites on the bones, on the muscles, on the cartilage, even on fat cells. Growth hormone, as its name suggests, stimulates growth. Well, also coming from the hypothalamus, hormone number 2 that will bind to cells in the adenohypophysis, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, also called somatostatin. The word somatostatin means static or inhibits the growth of the body. Some people call growth hormone somatotropin. That means it stimulates the body to grow. Anyway, back to GHIH, growth hormone inhibiting hormone made by the hypothalamus, binding at the somatotropes of the adenohypophysis, inhibiting their release of growth hormone. Hormone number 3 from the hypothalamus, traveling by way of the portal system, TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. So these travel to the adenohypophysis and bind upon cells there, which are called thyrotropes. When the TRH binds to the thyrotropes, they release into the blood their hormone, which is called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone enters into the blood, and as the name suggests, it has receptor sites at the thyroid gland. Hormone number 4 of the hypothalamus, CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, traveling by way of the portal system to the anterior pituitary. It binds upon cells called corticotropes. When the CRH binds to the corticotropes, they release into the blood their hormone, which is called adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. The receptor sites for ACTH, as we will see later, are at the adrenal cortex. The next hormone of the hypothalamus is called PRH, prolactin releasing hormone, travels down the portal system to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland and binds upon cells called mammotropes. When the PRH binds to the mammotropes, they release their hormone into the blood, which is called prolactin. The receptor sites for prolactin will be in the female mammary glands, in the male in the testes. The hypothalamus also makes prolactin inhibiting hormone, which will bind to the mammotropes and inhibit the release of prolactin into the blood. The hypothalamus also makes, as I mentioned earlier, the anterior nucleus of the hypothalamus makes gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. It travels by way of the portal system to the anterior lobe of the pituitary and binds upon cells there called gonadotropes. Well, a gonadotrope means it will stimulate the gonads. Well, when the GnRH binds to the gonadotropes, they release into the blood their hormones, which are called follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. The receptor sites for those two hormones are the gonads, and we will talk about them in enormous detail later on. Next slide, please. Well, repetition is essential to learning, so let me just repeat almost word for word what I just said on the previous slide. Listen up, take notes, write it down, tell little sister about it. These are those hypothalamic hormones that have receptor sites on cells in the adenohypophysis, the anterior aspect of the pituitary gland. So I did mention CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, made by the hypothalamus, binding on cells called corticotropes, prompting them to release their hormone, which is ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, stimulates the release of steroid hormones from the adrenal cortex. Number two, thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, made by the hypothalamus, binding on cells in the adenohypophysis called thyrotropes, prompting them to release thyroid stimulating hormone. This chart also lists prolactin as being stimulated there. That's the first time I've ever heard that. Well, maybe it is, maybe I don't know. I do know that it stimulates the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. What effect it has on prolactin secretion, this is the first I've ever heard of that. The next one, growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH. Obviously, this is going to bind at the somatotropes of the adenohypophysis, prompting them to release growth hormone. Somatostatin is the other word for growth hormone inhibiting hormone, GHIH. Somatostatin and GHIH are the same thing. So you can see there that it inhibits the release of growth hormone. There is a time in life when that is necessary. Otherwise, you become either a giant or you become acromegalic. The next one, gonadotropin releasing hormone. This is made by the hypothalamus. It binds upon cells in the pituitary gland called gonadotropes. The gonadotropes release their hormones, which are called luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. Next, prolactin releasing hormone made by the hypothalamus, binding upon cells in the adenohypophysis called mammotropes. The mammotropes then release prolactin. Prolactin will stimulate the activities of the mammary glands. And then last, we have prolactin inhibiting hormone, which chemically is the same compound that we called dopamine. It inhibits the release of prolactin from the mammotropes of the pituitary gland. So a lot of that is simply a repetition of what I just said, but I don't care. If repetition is what it takes for you to learn it, then I'll just keep right on repeating it. Okay, that's all for this show. I will have to probably split endocrinology up into several different PowerPoints because there is so much to be said.